Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman with Juan Gonzalez, our guest, Danny Schechter, the news dissector, executive editor of Media Channel, author of the new book Plunder. Max Fraud-Wolf also with us, economist and writer, a lecturer at the graduate program of international affairs at the New School. Max Fraud, please talk about IndyMac and what happened with it.
All right, so it's the largest bank failure since 1984, which was some time ago, so it has drama. I think, sadly, it's going to lose that record probably within 6 months or less, but for now, it's probably to a couple others. I mean, I wouldn't want to rank who's coming first, but it's not the last. I think they're pretty much universal agreement on that. Royal Bank of Scotland, which is not, poo-pooing banking for many obvious reasons, is estimating 150 to 300 small to mid-sized failures in the next 18 months, and that's not considered sort of off the charts. IndyMac's sort of an interesting story because it was partially seeded by two fellows from Countrywide, which much of your audience is probably familiar with, didn't have the best track record in the mortgage business. And they really specialized in a sort of small slice of the business called Alt-A. In the industry, when I was doing research, when we worked on this, we called these liar loans. Probably wasn't a bad name. Formerly, they're called no-doc, low-doc, or alternative A loans, which means you don't have to provide a lot of credit history or income verification. And so they did a lot of lending to people who were unwilling or unable to provide basic background information to their creditors, and it was concentrated in California and the Southwest. Roughly looking back from this particular vantage point, this is about the worst business to possibly be in on earth. So when Mr. Schumer wrote the letter that got all the attention, he was kind of stating something that everyone who's been following it knew, if in a little bit more obvious form. And basically, their relationship between the amount of money they'd lent and the amount of money they have and the amount of money they'd lost moved into a situation where it was just a question of time until the federal government came in and exercised what it has to do, ideally to keep people's faith in the banking system and shut it down, take it over, and employ FDIC, or Federal Deposit Insurance, so that people don't lose on their accounts. I would also mention that the FDIC cost of insuring all those accounts is probably equal to about 10% of the total money in FDIC, which means they're going to have to charge a much higher premium, or they themselves will have to be bailed out by another part of the federal government.
Can I just add to this? Because I spoke with Sheila Bain, who's the head of the FDIC, last December. I asked her, how many banks are going to fail? She fumbled around and came up with the number 76. Now we're talking over 300 potentially. So this crisis is just beginning, and this is one of the problems here. We read the headlines as if everything has already happened. The worst has happened. It hasn't yet, and that's what we have to brace ourselves for.
Danny, I want to ask about that because yesterday's Wall Street Journal had a big front page story about how the Securities and Exchange Commission is trying to stop private investment companies that are shorting banks, that are investing on the belief that these banks' stocks are going to go down, and they're claiming this is having an even more negative effect on banks. In essence, that there's speculation going on in the collapse of banks. Your response to this whole issue of shorting, and a lot of these banks, weren't they involved in helping to finance these kinds of short investments?
Absolutely. In fact, the New York Sun today, says that one of the problems here was that the regulators weren't paying attention to all these rumors and all these shorting processes. And this is what the FBI is looking into. My favorite headline is this one in The Onion. Recession-plagued nation demands new bubble to invest in. I think they're closest to the mark once again.
I do think there's something important in yesterday's SEC decision. Christopher Cox, SEC chairman under President Bush, is the Michael Brown of this. And he's actually underperformed Michael Brown. And he's going to be remembered as the Michael Brown of the debt tsunami here, or the debt flood, pretty easily. In addition to which, there's a big debate.
Michael Brown, the former FEMA.
The former FEMA
Brownie.
Yeah, Brownie. And the Arabian horse racing specialist who ended up in a job perhaps he was ill-suited for. But there's also another thing. On Wall Street, there was a lot of derision for Mr. Cox, and it's not exactly clear if the law he announced is in fact not a law that was passed in 1998, in which he was unaware of, and which he moderately embarrassed himself with one of his first major pronouncements being in fact a 9.5-year-old piece of legislation, which wouldn't, of course, not be a great sign if you've taken so long to interact in the markets and you're now doing something that's, in fact, already been done.
What about the comments of former Senator Phil Gramm, top economic advisor to Republican presidential candidate John McCain? Gramm recently claiming the country's merely in a mental recession.
No politician can talk about
That was Phil Gramm. Senator McCain says he's no longer speaking for him.
The interesting thing about Graham also is he was directly, personally involved as a lobbyist for subprime lenders. He was involved, as you know, your show reported, in actually creating a provision in the law that allowed the whole subprime boom to happen. In fact, when Bruce Marks was fighting the banks up in Boston, he went on the floor of the Senate and called him a terrorist for challenging predatory lending practices. So Fred Gramm, Dr. Phil too here, has been, involved on the wrong side of this issue for many, many years.
And what about the presumptive Democratic nominee, Senator Obama? What's been his position in terms of the crisis, the continuing and developing crisis?
Well, to my chagrin, the Obama campaign has not fully confronted this financial crisis. On Saturday last, Obama said he expects the government to do the right thing in terms of Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac without really spelling it out. Neither of the candidates have really spoken to this crisis, and neither has the progressive movement. We're much more interested in what's on the cover of the New Yorker than what's happening to millions of families in America. And I think that this is something that has to change, that we have to become much more aware of, informed about these economic issues, and engaged in trying to fight back against what's happening to the middle class, to the working class. And now ordinary Americans, wealthy Americans, are also being affected by this. We all are. Inflation goes up. Our money loses value.
But all these things are really dangerous because you've entered a space that's both too big to fail and too big to bail. These are too large to bail out and too large and too important to let fail. And so everybody's kind of caught a little bit deer in the headlights from the regulators and others trying to figure out what to do. They want to partially bail it, but it's so much money and it's ideologically difficult after 20 years of free market rhetoric. And so they kind of hope they can jawbone it and patch it and things will work themselves out. And that really hasn't proved to be a strategy that yields a lot of fruit, but people are kind of stuck in the shock mode and in the too big to bail and too big to fail.
And Max, I'd like to ask you in terms of internationally, because many of these securitized loans were being bought by institutions and pension funds all over the world. What's the impact worldwide on this?
A lot of losses, possibly more losses to come, and maybe most importantly, a slowing of the amount of money being lent into the United States, which in a credit-addicted society is potentially fatal for segments of the American middle class.